So hey, welcome to episode of Uncommon Conversations.
What episode is this?
This is going to be 28.
28?
28.
Really?
I think we've made it 28 episodes. 28. Well, I've made it 28.
I've not.
I don't know how many you've been on. But this is a show where we like to talk about issues of faith, life, politics, ethics. And well, tonight we're kind of circling around to have a conversation that we probably should have had before we've had some others, and that's a conversation at the foundation of ethics. Because you and I had a conversation a while back, a conversation I really enjoyed about what place does virtue hold in teaching in church.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought after that one, because we've had a lot of conversations about virtue. Virtue is something you've taught me a lot about.
Oh, okay.
And intrigued my interest in all the more. Mm-hmm. But also, what is virtue? Okay, so let's start there. Foundational. I'm going to have some rapid fire kind of questions for you tonight.
All right.
And let's just have the foundational kind of conversation about virtue, because maybe virtue is something you're unfamiliar with as somebody watching this. And we've had conversation about virtue before. What is virtue?
All right, so there's a few ways to define it. I think the easiest way, or at least for me the most helpful way, is to think of it as moral excellence. So virtue is moral excellence. So how does that get defined, right?
Yeah.
So according to the makeup of humans, right, and as Christians we would say, somehow in there's a spiritual side, there's obviously the physical side, the tangible side. Somehow, according to how we're made, we live in a way that is good for us, right? So that's that excellence piece, right? So if you're living morally, sometimes we think of moralism or morality or things like that, moralistic stuff. And there's some overlap sometimes. But generally speaking, it's living in a way that's good for you, right? So there's an end in sight. There's a goal. If you're living virtuously, you're living according to how you're made. You're living according to your purpose as humans.
Okay. Yeah.
And so you're living well. So living virtuously is living well.
This actually, the only point I feel like I would have anything to say tonight, actually, is you reminded me as you were saying that. So James Bryan Smith, author, Christian author, professor at Brothers University, correct me in the comments, he talked about a virtue, if I can remember it all, saying that it's like a channel that directs our energies towards harmony of how we are supposed to be. Is that?
Yeah,
I
would definitely agree with that. I don't know if that mental picture is what would be first that comes to my mind, but it's definitely in the same wheelhouse because according to classical thinking, if you have a virtue or if you have virtue, you're having sort of a habit of mind that fits within how you're made and what your purpose is. And kind of what your lot in life is. Of course, the classical understanding of virtue has a lot to do with the stratification of society too, right? So certain people, if they were a warrior class or a ruling class or serving class or whatever, those people were supposedly going to have more of this virtue or that virtue, right? And I think we can leave some of that stuff in the past. But
that makes me ask a whole bunch of other questions I won't ask for the sake of time tonight.
Right, But we as Christians can say that all people have the capacity for all of these virtues that are a part of how God has made us, right? God has made us with this ability to be good, right? And we can talk about the fall and all that stuff too. Sure. And even the ancient Greeks had this understanding of the fall, a little different than the Bible, but they had it. And so because of the fall, we also have this ability to do bad, but we still have this ability to do good, right? And where God's grace comes in, there's been plenty of discussion about that. Sure. But however you want to think about it, somehow you and I, we can do both good and we can do bad. And what we do that's good, if you're thinking about it in terms of virtue, the things that are good are also good for you. Right? So
they're not just a sense of duty, which is a question I'll have here in a minute.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
So sometimes, of course, if you're laying down your life for somebody else, that's a pretty noble thing, a pretty good thing. So in a sense, it may be bad for you in terms of life and limb. Sure. But it's still good for you because it's making you the best that you can be as an individual.
Okay, so so what is, if we're going to ask the question, I feel like I can substitute in virtue for moral excellence now. Would that be would you be happy with that? Okay, so what are the classical things that make up a moral excellence?
All right, so there are 4 cardinal virtues in the Western tradition, and this started with Plato, way back in the 4th century BC. And people group them in different ways, but basically you have justice, and you have you have courage, and you have prudence, and you have temperance. Okay.
Okay.
So
justice isn't one of them, or justice is.
Justice is.
Justice.
Yeah.
Okay. So explain for me. I think maybe I have the concept of justice.
Yeah.
But what's prudence? Temperance.
Well, we can start with justice. So basically, justice is doing for another person what would be considered best for that person.
Is it a sense of equality? Is that wrapped up in justice or not?
A lot of times, yes.
Okay.
Depending on who's writing what.
Okay.
There's more of a sense of equality or not, or even just giving someone what they deserve according to their station, right? Especially if we're thinking in the stratified society.
Idea, weights, scales, kind of idea of justice.
Mm-hmm,
okay. Mm-hmm. So then what's prudence?
So prudence is not a word we use a lot, right?
No.
Generally, when you think prudence, you either think the Beatles song, Dear Prudence, right? Or you think maybe like, oh, that person's a prude, right?
Right, yes. Okay, that comes to mind first.
Pretty derogatory.
Yes.
So prudence, it's based on an old Latin word. And basically what it means is applied wisdom. Okay, so in our conversations in the past, we've talked about how the Old Testament use of the word wisdom, the Hebrew word for wisdom, basically already has that wrapped into it.
It would be applied knowledge.
Yeah.
Maybe the way that I would have traditionally understood the concept of wisdom.
Yeah, a wisdom is applied knowledge, and I've heard things like that too. But knowledge and wisdom and prudence all are kind of categorized in their own way based on the language of the day in Greek and in Latin a little bit. So that's basically why those are chopped up the way they are. But I mean, for us, in thinking about wisdom applied or knowledge applied well.
Yeah. Excuse me.
Yeah, prudence I think is still a robust word as long as we get past some of the baggage it's picked up along the way.
Okay. What about courage?
Courage. So courage, another word for that is temperance. Or sorry, not temperance. Oh my goodness. What am I thinking? Okay, another word for that is fortitude.
Fortitude.
Right?
Okay, yeah.
So there are 2 aspects of courage that are worth thinking about, right? So there's this sense of attack, right? So not attack in terms of I'm courageous and I'm going to go take a knife or something, right? But in terms of approaching the situation with this sense of bravery, with the sense of making something hard happen,
right? Or
dealing with something hard, and then there's this sense of kind of long suffering that goes with it, or patience, or there are different ways of talking about it. But basically, there's these 2 things. So you approach a situation with courage, and then you continue, especially as sometimes hard things last days, months, years, decades, centuries, millennia, right? You continue to approach it with fortitude as well, and you continue to approach it with a sense of bringing a vulnerability and a sense of making things right as much as possible. So courage, that can, we can think about battlefield and all that, but in our lives, especially for those of us who don't really see war, don't really see battle, we're courageous when we speak the truth, right? So in the news recently, as of this recording, Harvey Weinstein, right? Yep. So people were not courageous, and
unfortunately not just him.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah, of course, yeah. But he's in the news recently, as far as when we're recording this. So people were not courageous because they didn't speak up about it, right? And so there's rumors that some people tried to, and they were kind of squashed. But even other directors and whoever else, like
not everyone who knew said something,
right? And even like Quentin Tarantino, right, famous director, he had worked with Weinstein, and he said, I wish I had said more. Right? Basically what he's saying, or he could have said it in a different way, was, I wish I had been courageous. Right? So would he have lost out on something? Quite possibly, right? Because Weinstein funded all of, as far as I know, all of his early movies, made him a success.
Right. Yeah.
So he had a lot to lose, but he didn't pursue truth or justice.
Yeah.
Right? And if he had, who knows what he would have lost,
Sure.
but that would have been more of an act of courage. Or even think about someone who has a long-term disability or sickness or illness. That takes that kind of long-suffering, patient side of courage, where you need to face it consistently and in a continual, ongoing way, in a way that you can still say, I am doing my best to live a life that's done well, to live a life that has some measure of joy. And we can all think of examples of people who face illness with courage, right? And they don't complain all the time, and they kind of grin and bear it, or maybe something even better than that. And then there's those people who all they do is whine and moan and say, oh, my back, or oh, I can't believe this is happening to me. Right.
So what makes courage different than like a fearlessness or like a foolishness that you would almost associate? Because I watch YouTube videos all the time of people who are absolutely fearless and they do really foolish things. What, is that courage? What makes that different?
Yes.
How is it like it sounds more like a faithfulness to like the good thing or something.
That's definitely part of it. There's always a sense of vulnerability. There's always something to lose, right? If you're having to act courageously, or if there's an opportunity to act courageously, you're stepping out to be your best self when you could lose something, right? It could be something as simple as losing an acquaintance who doesn't like what you said, to losing a job, to losing a loved one who isn't going to have anything to do with you anymore, to even losing your life. But it's always kind of a worthy cause, right? So that's the faithfulness to something good. That's where that might come in.
Anything.
Right. So it's you remember almost 20 years ago now, Johnny Knoxville and his compadres, they would do all these crazy stunts and we
couldn't label any of that courage.
Yeah, that wasn't necessarily courage, because they could lose something, and you talk to them now, and they talk about all the surgeries they've had, all the aches and pains, right? They've lost some sort of health because of all that crazy stuff. But it wasn't for something greater. It wasn't for something that was a betterment. It wasn't making the world better. It wasn't going towards being one's best.
Now you're just offending people.
I mean,
no, I'm just joking. All right. So what about temperance? So what is temperance? What does temperance look like?
So temperance is basically this sense of self-control, right? So when you see something and you maybe want it, right, but it's not good for you, right? So that third donut, or that extra Big Mac, or let's think some more serious, that woman or man who is not someone you are in a relationship with, when you're in a relationship with someone else, whatever it might be, you're tempted to do this thing. But temperance is kind of this sense of self-control, where you're like, no, I'm not going to do that, right? So it leads to moderation generally, but sometimes I've heard it called moderation. That's not exactly it, because moderation is more the result than the thing itself. So temperance is kind of one's habit of mind, right? We're talking about habit of mind. Habit of mind, whereby they can control the passions, right? That's a classical word. They can control those feelings inside of them that make them want to do things that would not be good for them in the long run.
Okay. Those are the 4 cardinal virtues, as you put it, right?
Yeah.
I grew up and I've heard a lot about faith, hope, and love.
Right. The Christian virtues, they're generally called. So faith, hope, and love comes from the end of 1 Corinthians 13. right? It's this whole chapter where Paul is telling the Corinthians who haven't been very loving, that love is necessary. And then he ends it by saying, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. And he doesn't really go into it that much, right? But in the years since, many a theologian has talked about how those are the core of Christianity, right? So
it does seem to be a little triad he uses in other places. Talk about your faith springs up from the hope and leads to your love. Like he tends to use it in other places,
right?
And love obviously is I would say the center ethic of the New Testament. Jesus tends to make it the center.
And then there's a lot of Trinitarian Framework, right?
Sure.
Patterns of three. Moderns aren't all that interested in those numbers, but ancients and medieval folks were more interested in seeing this correlation between a Trinitarian threefold world and other sort of threefold things, right? And then even just like the three virtues, right? The Christian virtues plus the 4 virtues, the cardinal virtues, make 7 virtues. Which
I was going to say, so that's a big deal then that we have 7 virtues.
Yeah. So seven traditionally is a big deal because it's a number that points to God, right? You think of 7 days of creation,
sure,
all kinds of things like that. So.
So those would be you would put those as your 7 classical virtues, or at least your 4, and then
the 4 and the 3. Four cardinal virtues.
Okay.
So cardinal in the sense of the other virtues hinge on them, or if you drew a family tree, they would be kind of the ancestors of all the other virtues.
So if you put up things like simplicity or whatever, you put other things up there, kindness, patience, you would find them nested under these 4.
Under those 4, and then if you broaden it out, you could nest them within the 3 Christian virtues. And then of course, I know he's not your favoritist, right? But Augustine talked a lot about love and how all of this was centered in love, and not just him, but he was the one who, as arguably the premier scholar in the West for over 1,000 years, he
maybe he was just saying what Paul was saying. The greatest of these is love.
Yeah, and he was, and that was the text that he was using when he talked about all the virtues, and he talked about the cardinal virtues too. But he talked about how it all comes from love, and if these aren't done with love, right? Because think about a virtuous person, right? If a virtuous person does not have love, right? As far as we could tell, they could still be doing all of the right things,
right?
But in terms of theology and God, if God is looking at this person and those things that are done well aren't motivated by love in some sort of way, then they're all for naught. They are not worth anything. That's when it becomes kind of a unnecessary or superfluous moralism.
Got it.
Right? So it might be good in society, but it's not really good for that person because it's not coming out of this center that's most in line with God. Right? So in terms of theology, if you want to think about these virtues, if you are living virtuously, you are living the way that God intends. Right? Because these virtues, you can talk about how they are all in a way like how God is. Right? So is God just? Yes. Is God courageous? Yes. Look at what Jesus did. Is God temperate? Yeah, there's all kinds of stories in the Old Testament where God holds back. There's all kinds of stories in the New Testament about Jesus facing temptation or whatever else. And he always seems to do the right thing at the right time. Okay? And then is God... where did I go? Oh, wisdom. Yeah, is God wise? Of course. Yeah, God's wise. So,
no, absolutely. Okay, so... This makes me want to skip the next question I had because you keep bumping up against it. So how is this different than duty?
Duty, okay, so duty.
So, like, I have to do this. The Bible tells me I have to follow these things. I'm asked to do it. Is that really what it's saying? Is probably a much bigger question that we could ask. But really, how is the construct of virtue different than the construct of duty? Because maybe it could sound like, well, if you talk so much about virtue, it's just telling me what I have to do.
Yeah, and I think that to a large degree, it's a different lens looking at something similar. Okay. But I think that the lens of virtue or virtue ethics is a little bit more life-giving. because when you think about duty, oftentimes you think about where you lapsed in what you were obligated to do, and then it's a lot easier to kind of have some self-hatred or bashing yourself or that kind of thing, which in the long run, kind of being pitiful and sorrowful about your past without changing, it's not going to help. Okay. So if you're thinking like virtue ethics does towards an end goal, right, an end goal of living as God would have you, living in the same way that Christ himself would if he were in your shoes, I think that's more of a positive thing. So as followers of Christ, are there duties? Yeah, and I mean, pastors, theologians, priests, all kinds of folks have been arguing over how exactly that looks, right? And will until the Lord returns, right? But if someone is thinking about virtue, they are thinking primarily about what it looks like to live well, right? And so it's...
So is this a difference between following a set of rules and fulfilling like a purpose, like why you were created? Could you look at it as a different paradigm than that? Yeah. Whereas like duty is the sense of like, here's the right and the wrong things you have to do, whereas virtue is really telling you like, this is who you were created to be?
Yeah, there's something like that. So when you think about different of the fathers who talked about the chief goal more or less being obedient to the law of Christ, or you talk about Kant, right, and Kantian moral philosophy, where there's plenty of obligation there, and deontology and all that stuff that we don't need to get way into. But the sense of duty is very much pronounced. Yeah. And with those things, you're always looking for the rule. But with virtue and with virtue ethics, the rules can be helpful, but the rules don't become kind of the end-all be-all quite as much, right? Sure. It becomes, what is the goal? What is the goal? And is the goal living excellently, right? And for Christians, is the goal living according to God's design for humans generally, and even in some regards, me as an individual? I think that's a lot more life-giving. And I'm reminded of Augustine once again, who talks about how if you are doing things out of love, if you're truly being loving, you cannot do wrong, right? And so that's like way more profound, and I think gets more to the heart of who God is. A person who is
rule keeping out of duty.
Right. If God is love, right, it makes more sense to always be thinking about living in a way that propels us towards that kind of love, right? Instead of living in a way that puts fences around things and makes sure everything is neat and tidy, right? Neat and tidy is not always wrong. Sure. Right? It's not always bad, and sometimes it's helpful. But it's usually not the best thing, right? So think about exceptions to the rule often prove the rule. Life is awfully complex. Yeah. Whatever. Yeah. Yeah. So like when I was growing up, I was trained in classical piano, right? Right. When I was little, there's all kinds of rules like do this, do that, do this, do that. Follow this time signature. Follow these notes. These notes have this amount of time, that amount of time, whatever else, right?
Sure.
And for me, and then for those who have far more talent than I do, those rules are great. Those are the foundation. But if you can move beyond those rules, that's where the true musicality comes out. That's where the artistry comes out.
Sure.
In a way that you bend the rules and you move beyond them to something that's better, that's more beautiful.
So in a way, it's like when raising children.
Yeah.
You have to start with structure and rules, but what you really hope to instill in them is not because you couldn't provide them enough rules in life. Yeah. What you really want to instill in them is a sense of moral compass, that sense of moral excellence, that virtue. Yeah. So that when they're in any kind of given circumstances, they know what to do, and it may not look like fitting a particular duty or role.
Right. You want your sons. I want my son. We don't have any daughters, but we want our sons to be good guys.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we want them to be good people, and another way of thinking about that is we want them to live in a morally excellent way. Why? Because life's better for them, right? One thing that we haven't really talked about yet, but if you're living virtuously, generally speaking, you're living in a way that is better and more life-giving, right? So think about people who are intemperate or cowardly or whatever else. What rules them? It's kind of that intemperance or vice in the old way of thinking. It's that vice that has rule over them, right? So they're always anxious about whatever they're afraid of. They're always susceptible to whatever their temptation is, right? So they almost don't have this control over themselves. But if you're living virtuously, you have more of a sense of control, and you have more of an ability to face hard things and easy things in a way that going through them, you'll be able to find more enjoyment, and you'll be able to just have patterns that help you along the way. So again, it's if you're living virtuously, you're living excellently, and there's this goal of living well. And the ancients even talked about how it's a eudaimonistic way of living.
Explain that to me. Right? Explain that to us.
Yeah. So that means there's an end goal of being happy, right? So if you're living virtuously, you're going to be more happy, right? So the people
doesn't mean that you're always will be happy, but it means that type of life will be is those things bring happiness.
Right. There's more of a sustained sense of joy in that kind of life. And joy and happiness are definitely synonyms in this sense. Okay, so we can think again about people who live according to what used to be called vices, right? Or live viciously, right? So what are some mid 20th century vices, right? So maybe drugs, right? People who are given to drugs, they're addicted to drugs, are they happy? No, most of the time they're not. They're looking for the next fix, and they are desperate. Or think about other vices from yesteryear. Sex, right? So people who really want sex all the time, they'll kind of let it rule over their lives. They just let it happen when it happens, or they're seeking it out. Are those people?
All of these things sound like you'll either rule your life or it will be ruled. Is that kind of the basic framework?
That's kind of it, and that sounds pretty Pauline too, right?
Sure.
So we can see that, and of course those are extreme examples, but the more that you give in to things that are not virtuous, right, the less likely that you'll be able to be happy in a long-term way.
All right, so this has been a really deep and possibly very long conversation about virtue. I've totally lost track of time. So, but one that I think has been incredibly valuable. I know this study of virtue for me has really given life to my Christian life.
Yeah, for me too, because probably like yourself, I grew up in a situation where I was more or less taught that Christianity meant checking off lots of boxes.
Right.
Yeah. And so moving beyond that left me a little wary, I don't know what to do. But then moving towards this sense of virtue ethics is really life-giving.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And it answers a whole lot of questions.
Yeah.
Really seems to make sense for me. So I hope in some real way it has for you. And I'd love for you to join in this conversation. One of the questions that has probably gotten left off of this video is, should we still care about virtue today? Do you still care about virtue today? Have you given virtue much consideration? In a postmodern world, is virtue something that you think is still credible? We'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, please comment below.
Thanks, guys.
Peace.